I like the way you framed this notion of wholesome provincialism, and it seems appropriate in our politically dark times. But as I was thinking about what you had to say about the aesthetics of Roycean's notion of creativity, and maybe pragmatism in general, is that for all of the emphasis on community and upon creativity, what he totally fails to understand, or he's irrelevant, it seems to me, to much of the art movements of the 20th century. That is, that he has no comprehension for, let's say, unwholesome communities or unwholesome modernism. That nihilism is the force that has fed so much of the art of this century that doesn't seem to fit into Royce's. Well, Joyce doesn't fit either. And even with William James, you could say yes, the streams of his notion of consciousness affected various modernists, but James was not open to modernism as such in literature, I think. What about that myopia that they might have in Royce and art?
Royce did not write much on aesthetics and on art, although he talks about aesthetics and talks about these deadly church buildings that have nothing going for them and that sort of thing. I think and it's not emphasized enough in our Royce scholarship, and perhaps he himself didn't emphasize enough, but he clearly talks about rebellion and asserting of self-image and so on as important. I think he would, however, on the other side, be very concerned about pursuing nihilism in the sense that it seems to ultimately, I don't know what he'd say, because he was community or the ability to build community. I don't think he minded rebellion and going off into kind of strange things, but I think he felt that there had to be some, we call it wholesome or unwholesome. I think he just felt that any community that seeks to tear down and destroy community would be dangerous. I don't know that he would just completely, but he would be concerned to address it and address the issues that brought it about, I think.
Fair-minded. Okay. Thank you. You mentioned about in framing your talk on a philosopher's old, Josiah Royce, with our contemporary scene of tension and polarization and violence. And you talked about a goal of a conversational context for mutual agreement and affirming the dignity of each.
Right.
That seems to be gathered from Royce's context, from Royce's theories, from Royce as a kind of a herald for this direction. Do you see that potential also coming from a Jamesian strand, from William Jamesian strand, or do you see it as something that is that potential coming out of someone like Royce, who is indeed more interested in finding foundations of monism rather than a James who is interested perhaps in doing some of the same things, but coming out of a context of pluralism?
Well, I think it's a mistake to think of Royce as a monist. He was not a monist. I tried to make that clear. It was pluralism. I would think that James, in his, developing individual, and again, I said at the beginning, I think the difference in the way James and Royce approach this whole notion of diversity and variety is that Royce lived in a chaotic, diverse, conflictual situation in his youth in the mining camps and then in San Francisco, where there was constant tension between groups and so on. There was no sense of community, and his history of California talks about building order out of chaos. It's basically about that. And he was aware of all kinds of things. So I think his emphasis is more on building community, but I don't think that ultimately he was looking for monism. He was very concerned that individual variety and dignity be respected. He was not trying to meld everybody. Now, I grant you that early in his metaphysics this comes across, but as he grew, as my friend here said, as he grew and developed and interacted with the world, I think he was moving in that direction.
You just touched on the question I wanted to ask you, but I'll try it again.
Okay.
The relationship between the social and ethical philosophy you've just been explaining and his metaphysical philosophy, which is still idealist, it seems to me, in some sense. And I was going to ask what you think of the relationship between what you've just expounded and metaphysics. Does he abandon his early philosophy? Is one dependent on the other, or do you think they're separate?
Well, I don't think Royce ever abandoned anything, but Royce, what I want to say that Royce did is enrich and develop. He was, I'm thinking of Dennett's word about human beings are inframores. He was just always seeking new ideas and always wanting to discuss new ideas. And I think he grew and developed right down to, the last class. And Frank has done some very good work on his work with his so on in his teaching of the ethics and so on. And I am not exactly sure myself, because I haven't explored in any detail, exactly where he ended up metaphysically, but I would want to claim, and probably be in deep water, that he was moving in the direction of process philosophy and Whitehead and Hartshorne type of understanding of the spirit of community is very... It reminds me of Hartshorne and Hartshorne's God Who Grows and the suffering. That's where I think he was going. But I have not researched it, and so I'm just speaking out of my own gut feeling. Yeah.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for your wonderful paper. Just a reference to your last statement, that time is constitutive. I wonder if we took and it's difficult to say this because I like to research Royce, but I'm going to make a Jamesian point. Paul Ricoeur said that human time is narrative time. And then in volume 2 of Time and Narrative, he spends that volume telling us how different narratives shape different times. And particularly in relationship to our personal identity, when we begin to think about narrative shaping of our identity, we may forget that our narrative identity is on a spectrum of vastly different types of time. For example, you take Augustine's Confessions, and there's the vision with Monica, where you have a vision of eternity. That is a different type of time than the time of the Hopis, who are living up on Third Mesa and who actually say civilization, Western civilization, will disappear. It is a moment in a 3,000-year history of their time. So Western civilization will become a footnote to their time. And then there is the time of those young people that I see in the mall that seem to change style every half year. Now, given that we would like to shape a community of communities, what can you say about how narrative time and unifying narratives might function in that way, and how we can deal with the fact that my time is just not your time?
I mentioned just briefly, I'm teaching a senior seminar, and I taught last quarter on a whole new field called neuroethics, believe it or not. The brain research has shown that, as a matter of fact, we interpret all the time and we create a narrative all the time. I think what Royce, and I just happened to pick this up in the bookstore, what Sen is talking about is being able to understand that exactly what you said, that narratives are different and we can't slap on a general on each person, and he talks about himself, as being a Hindu and being a Bangladesh and being this and that, and all of us have multiple loyalties and multiple narratives and so on, and how the way we begin to build understanding is by sharing those stories and what our hopes are. Alex Reed, I heard him speak at a Basque conference. I mentioned him in there, who worked with the Irish and is now working with the Basque, says that it's very important to get all the parties to the table to talk about their narrative and their story. And the key, as I said, in Ireland was nobody paid any attention to Sinn Féin and think they had anything to say. And once they were recognized as having a narrative, and that narrative was beginning to be shared among the other narratives, this is a way. But I absolutely agree with you that narrative time differs from individual to individual, and I think Royce recognized that. And it's continually growing. We're growing all the time in our narrative.
Interested both in your wonderful lecture that we've just heard, but in some of the previous speakers, how the theme of mediation keeps emerging as seemingly central to both Royce and James. And you have begun to, I think, in your lecture, to address the issue of how well mediation can work in our time in situations where there is a great disparity of power. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could say some more about that. I think your example of what has happened and is happening in Ireland is a very good example of what mediation has and is continuing to accomplish over a fairly lengthy period of time. Mm-hmm. The Basque situation in light of Ireland sounds hopeful. The Middle East sounds less hopeful. And in the world in which we live, in which the United States at this point carries so much power, what does mediation do for us in a situation in which power is so disparate?
No. Well, first of all, this is just my own thing. Mediation is a standard term often used in collective bargaining and that sort of thing, and I don't like the term because it usually means some kind of compromise was done that nobody really likes and everybody sort of give and take. I think interpretation is the term I would like to use because, again, it respects each individual involved in and tries to really listen to the concerns and to build some levels of common understanding. I think Sen, and I mentioned the fellow that's written on Middle East, I think everyone's beginning to realize we need to find, and I think it's in small groups, and I mentioned the non-political groups that may help us, such as international corporations. I can give you a concrete example of a power differential in our community. PG&E wanted to do a particular thing in our community, and the community was up in arms. So our Institute of Ethics got involved doing a Roycean interpretation and making clear the interests of various elements in the community to the corporation, which had a lot more power than most of these individuals. So as Royce says, I think it has to be done in small areas. We have to begin in areas where we think we might be able to bring the parties together, but I think we have to try. And obviously in the Middle East, Sen is saying we have to get over this categorizing everybody in terms of religion or in terms of so-and-so, because these people have many different identities and they're not all coming from the same place with the same narrative. And somehow we need to get people like corporations or other groups that can work across lines of international lines. And, it's not going to be easy. It's difficult. But I think it has promise.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.